I also forgot to mention, right off the bat here, uh, that my mom came up today to help with the light bulb situation. As you all know, the light bulbs are very high in our house, and I have a fear of lights. So they came up also to go to J.C. Penney's and run another errand up here. But mainly it was to help with the light bulbs. So we got to see them for 2.2 seconds while they changed the light bulbs on my lunch hour. And they went home. And it was nice to visit for just a little bit before they went home. But like I said, they had some errands up here to run, so that's the only reason we saw them. And it was short, nice visit, but we'll see them next Sunday. See everybody next Sunday, we hope. Anyway, uh, we're going to read Diana Palmer's The Rancher's Wedding. Now I'm going to give you the description on the back since we're going to start this book already. This is the first. I've never started one of these books while I'm reading it. So I have to mark where I've stopped at so I don't reach that point. I'm going to try to read the first 50 pages with you tonight. That's my goal. But let me read you the back of the book. Then we're going to read the first 50 pages. Take a walk down the aisle Western style with these tales of unbridled love. From a trio of New York Times best-selling authors who knew the way to a cowboy's hearts. Or who know the way to the cowboy hearts, sorry. The first is The Rancher's Wedding, a Diana Palmer story. When a rugged Colorado rancher who's in the red meets up with a screenwriter turned waitress dogged by scandal, they put their talents and their hearts together, but will the front page news put a damper on the sparks flying between them? No one beats the author for sensual anticipation. Rave reviews. Okay. It says, also available from Diana Palmer Zebra Books, The Snowman and Amelia. To my friend Tara Gavin, who has been with me through many adventures, and to her lovely daughters, Emma Grace and Mary Margaret, who seem like a part of my family too. Okay, first 50 pages, remember. Chapter 1. Cassie Reed wondered why none of the other protesters had shown up at this ranch. Were they were supposed to be picketing at this restaurant where she was a waitress? One of the customers who flirted with her had told her horror stories about this place. This rancher had 3 big chicken houses, the cowboy said, and he kept the lights on all night so that the poor chickens would be forced to lay over and over again, without rest. It just was so sad, he said. So he had some of the other men who worked on the ranches near Benton, Colorado, were going to form a picket line and show Big Jack Denton that he couldn't get away with animal cruelty in this small community. Cassie, who recently moved to Benton from a house north of Atlanta on a huge lake, was shocked with such a thing that would be tolerated. Couldn't the cowboy just call the local animal control people? He replied that they didn't have one. There was a county shelter, but it was hard to get people to go against Big Jack, who had the reputation locally for his hot temper. So if they picketed, maybe some of the newspaper or television stations would come and do a story and put him out of business. The thought of the newspaper coverage gave her a pause, but after all, this was Colorado. Neither Cassie nor her father were known here. That was a blessing, after the tragedy they sustained. Her customer, whose name was Carrie, said that she should join them, and if she liked, they were protesting on Saturday morning. She agreed that she'd love to help. Her father had been skeptical, but she'd convinced him to drop her off at the entrance to the ranch. There'd be lots of people, she assured him, and she'd phone him when he needed to come get her. He was off on Saturday from his job at the local farm supply store, where he sold heavy equipment like harvesters and irrigation equipment. He got in the job through an acquaintance. He couldn't go on living in New York City after the scandal. He wanted a change. He lost his wife, Cassie's mother, as well as a fabulous, well-paying job. The scandal had cost him. The stigma was so great that he and his daughter had moved across country in hope that they wouldn't be hounded by reporters anymore. His full name was Lanier Roger Reed, but a lot of people would recognize that first name with the story so fresh. So he used his middle name instead, hoping that in a small town like Benton he would go unnoticed. Colorado seemed like a nice place, and her father got along well with Bill Clay, the man who owned the agricultural equipment business. Cassie and her father had found a house, then she lucked out finding an open job at the town's own restaurant, the Grey Dove, waitressing. It wasn't her true profession, but she had to take what she could get for the time being. So she was here several weeks after starting her job, and she wondered if she'd left her mind back in Georgia. It was insane to be standing out here all alone in the middle of driving rain, but it was raining. Not only raining, sleeting. Her father had left her reluctantly. She had a coat, but it was better suited for Georgia's warmer climate, not freezing Colorado weather. Winter here was harsher than she expected, and her light coat wasn't doing much good. Her fingers were freezing, and she carried a homemade sign that read, "Chickens shouldn't be mistreated." Her feet were freezing too. What had seemed like a good idea in the warm restaurant was looking like a foolhardiness in the face of icy winter. She shivered. Surely the other picketers would eventually show up. Nobody was anywhere around. There wasn't any traffic in the back road. There was a sign that read Denton Bardee Ranch, and an odd-looking symbol that was probably his registered cattle brand. No cowboys in sight either. Maybe they were gathering eggs in those warm chicken houses. She paced and marched some more, unaware of the security camera that had been recording her every move. Minutes later, a big burgundy luxury SUV pulled up at the gate and an engine died. The door opened. A big man in a denim and shepherd's coat with a black Stetson hat slanted over one eye and big boots peering out from underneath that thick denim jeans stood there looking at her incredulously. "Do you work here?" she asked, her teeth chattering as she shivered. "Sort of. What are you doing?" He asked in a deep, amused voice. "Picketing. The man who owns this place oppresses poor chickens." He blinked. "Chickens?" "In his chicken house," she explained. She pulled her useless coat closer. She didn't even have a cap on her reddish gold hair. Her blue eyes met his shaded ones. She wondered idly what color his eyes were because they weren't visible underneath the brim of his hat. "He tortures chickens," she continued. "He keeps the lights on all the time so those poor creatures will lay eggs. It's an abomination." He pursed his sensuous lips and cocked his head at her side. "Chicken houses," he said, nodding. "That's right. Who sent you?" She blinked. "Nobody sent me. This cowboy's in the restaurant where I work said a whole group was coming to picket, and he invited me too. He's nice. His name is Carey." "Carey?" Now he looked very amused. "Tall guy, black hair, scar on his lip?" "Well, yes," she said. He chuckled. "He's my cousin. I gave him that scar on his lip." Her eyebrows raised. "Your cousin?" "Yes, and he's known for practical jokes, although this one is low, even for him," he added, studying her. "Come with me. You'll freeze to death in this weather." He looked around. "You didn't drive here." "My dad brought me here. Can I see the chicken houses if I go with you?" she asked, trying to sound belligerent. He smiled. "Sure, come on." She put her sign in the back seat, and the letters were fading because it was on cardboard. She got in beside the man and automatically fastened her seat belt. It was a nice vehicle, big and fancy, with heated seats and powdered windows, with a CD player built into the dash. "This is great," she remarked. "It's functional," he replied. He wheeled the vehicle around and headed it down the ranch road. "You got a name?" he asked. "Oh, I'm Cassie," she said. "Cassie Reed." She studied him, and he had a handsome face, if a little rugged, sensuous mouth, long nose, and a square jaw. "Who are you?" "You can call me J.L.," he offered. "This is a big place," she remarked as he sped down the road. "Thousands of acres," he agreed, "plus a lot of leased government land for grazing. Takes a lot of cowboys to keep it going." "Does Carey work for you?" He laughed. "He does his best not to work at all," he said. "Mostly he goofs off and lies to people." "Lies to people?" He slowed as they approached the sprawling brick house sitting in the middle of the other widely spaced buildings, including the barn, stable, a silo, and a metal equipment shed far bigger than the house Cassie and her father even lived in. She looked around, frowning. "Where are the chicken houses?" she asked, surprised. He chuckled as he pulled up the drive toward the house. "I don't keep chicken," he said. "I run purebred Black Angus cattle." "But Carey said," she began. "Carey was pulling your leg," he assured her. "How do you know that?" "Because this is my ranch," he replied. "I'm J.L. Denton." She ground her teeth together. She was embarrassed. "Why?" she asked miserably, pushing back a scrap of her drenched red hair. "Why would he do that to me?" "Carrie likes a practical joke," he said. He was recalling another of his cousin's jokes, even if less funny than this one was. Carrie would spill his guts for enough drinks, and a unscrupulous woman had plied him with an alcohol to find out enough about J.L. to come on to him in a big way. J.L. had thought about he'd found the perfect woman. She seemed to be exactly like him in attitude, in politics, likes and dislikes and everything. She had taken him almost to the brink of marriage, in fact, until he heard what she said to someone on her cell phone when she hadn't known his cousin Carrie was listening. Carrie was heartbroken to tell him about it. He said that she was telling a friend that she found this reclusive rich rancher and he was dumb enough to accept her pretense as fact. She learned enough about him to mirror his thoughts, and now he was going to marry her and she'd have everything she ever wanted. She wouldn't stay on this dumpy ranch for long, she added. Once the ceremony was over, she'd go back to Beverly Hills and get a nice apartment in some fancy building and shop, shop, shop. It had seemed to surprise her, Carrie added, when she turned around and found him standing right behind her. She stammered an excuse and begged him not to tell J.L., but he refused. It was rotten, low-down, dirty thing to do, he said indignantly, and he marched right back to J.L.'s ranch to tell him all about it. J.L. had been livid. She'd come home that night. He met her at the door with her things, neatly packed by his housekeeper, and her into 2 suitcases. He asked her for his engagement ring back and told her that he wanted nothing else to do with her. She stared at him blankly as if she feared for his sanity. Why was he doing this, she asked. Because he knew what sort of woman she was, and Carrie had told him what he overheard her saying on the cell phone. She countered that she knew what he thought of her family, and she should have broken the engagement when he made that remark about her father. He couldn't remember saying anything about her father, whom he never even met, instantly disliked, but he passed over it. He never wanted to see her again, he added. Carrie had also mentioned her opinion of him as a lover, which put his pride in the dirt. He didn't tell her about that. It still hurt too much. She wanted to talk it out, but once he knew, he gave in and he would take her back and she'd stab him in the back. He closed the door in her face and she left. He hadn't heard anything else from her. Carrie had mentioned that he had heard she'd gone to Europe to take a job in some winery as a receptionist. J.L. hadn't paid that remark much attention. It didn't occur to him to wonder how Carrie knew it. The whole experience had warped him. He'd have staked his life on her honesty, but she sold him out. He'd never trust another woman. He had 3 months of absolute bliss until Carrie told him about the truth about this perfect fiancé. Now he was distraught. He drank too much, brooded too much. He let his ranch slide, endangering his livelihood. He didn't blame Carrie exactly, but he associated the man with his misfortune, and it pained to have him around. And here sat a victim of his cousin's warped sense of humor. She looked absolutely crushed. "Don't take it so hard," he said. "Carrie can fool most people when he tries." He glanced at her as they approached the huge 1-story brick ranch house. "Why did you think that I kept chickens on a ranch?" "I'm from Atlanta," she said, then flushed because she hadn't wanted to admit that. "Well, north of us a lot of people have chicken houses. I heard stories about how they were kept," but Carrie said. She stopped. I swallowed, I guess. Carrie knew about them somehow. "I'm just sorry I picketed you," she added miserably. He was surprised at how much he liked her. She was vulnerable in a way that most women today weren't, especially in his circle of acquaintances. She had a sensitivity that was rare. "What do you do?" "I'm a waitress at the Grey Dove restaurant in Benton. Carrie comes in there a lot," she added reluctantly. A waitress. Well, he hadn't expected a debutante, he thought sarcastically. "Carrie runs his mouth too much," he murmured. "Yes, he does," she agreed. "That coat is too thin for a Colorado winter," he remarked. She winced. "I guess so. We don't get a lot of really cold temperatures in Atlanta," she added. He chuckled. "I wouldn't expect it to be that cold in the deep South," he agreed. He liked her accent. It was soft, sweet drawl. "Yes, well, we don't get much snow either. Only very rarely. And then the whole city just shuts down," she added with a soft laugh. He grinned. "I can imagine. We used to get snow because we have so much of it." He pulled up to the front of the ranch house. "Come on in," he said as he swung out the door of the SUV. She hesitated. She'd never gone to a man's house or apartment in her life. Her father and her mother had her sheltered. She was an only child, and she had lots of health problems through her youth. She dated very rarely, and mostly double dates had been with her best friend Ellen. She grimaced. She missed Ellen. "It's all right," he assured her as he opened the door for her. "I don't bite." She flushed. "Sorry, I'm not used to men. Not much." Both thick eyebrows went up over his silvery eyes. She cleared her throat. She unbuckled her seat belt and held on to the handle above the door so that she didn't fall out. It was a very tall vehicle. "Shrimp," he mused. She laughed self-consciously. "I'm only 5'7" she protested, but she had to look up, way up, to see his amused smile. "I'm 6'2". To me, you're a shrimp," he added. He went ahead of her to open the door. She hesitated just for a minute. She was really cold, and her clothes were drenched. "Bathroom's that way," he said, indicating the hallway. The floors were wood, with throw rugs and the Native American patterns. Furniture in the living rooms was cushy and comfortable. There was a huge TV on the wall and a fireplace on the other. It was very modern. "Thanks," she said belatedly, and when she realized she was staring around, "I'll see what I can scare up for you in the way of dry clothes." "We're not the same size," she protested, measuring him. He chuckled. "No, we're not. But my housekeeper's daughter left some things behind when she came to visit her mom. You're just about her size." He walked off toward the other end of the house. She darted into the huge bathroom and took off her coat. She looked like a drenched chicken, she thought miserably. At least the bathroom was warm. She heard the heavy footsteps come back and a quick rap on the door as she opened it. "Here." He handed her some jeans and a shirt. "Thanks," she said. He shrugged. "Come out when you're ready. We'll throw your things that are wet into the dryer." "Okay." She had to put her jeans and shirt over her underwear, which was damp. She wasn't about to take it off and put it in a dryer in front of a man she didn't know. She was painfully shy. She came out of the bathroom. He called to her from the distant room. She followed the sound of his voice to a sprawling kitchen. "You drink coffee?" he asked. "Oh, yes," she agreed. "Give me those." He held out his hand for her clothes. "I'll stick them in the dryer." "Thanks." He gave them a curtsy look and pursed his lips amusedly at the lack of underthings and took them to the dryer, and still in another room. She heard it kick off. He came back and poured her some coffee into two thick white mugs. "Cream? Sugar?" "No," she replied, seating herself at the small table against the window. Outside cattle were milling around a feed trough. "I always drink it black and strong. It helps me keep awake when I'm working." She stopped suddenly. "Waitressing didn't work at night in Benson." He raised an eyebrow, but he didn't question the odd comment. She sipped the coffee and sighed. "This is very good." "It's Colombian," he replied. "I'm partial to it." "So am I." He sipped his coffee and stared at the odd house guest. He wondered how old she was. She had that radiant, perfect complexion that was common in young women, but she didn't look like a teenager despite her slender figure. She lifted a brow at his eyebrows, an obvious appraisal. "I was wondering how old you were," he said, smiling. "Oh, I'm 24." He cocked his head. "You look younger." She smiled. Her blue eyes almost radiated with warmth. "Everybody says that." She wondered how old he was. His hair was black and thick, conventionally cut. His face was strong, with an imposing nose and chiseled mouth with high cheekbones. His skin had a faint olive tone. He chuckled. "Sizing me up, too?" "I have Comanche ancestors." "I thought Comanches lived in Texas and Oklahoma," she began. "They do. I was born south of Fort Worth, Texas. That's where my mother came from. My folks moved back here when I was 10. The ranch was started by my great-grandfather. My grandfather and my father had some sort of blow-up. My dad and mom left when I was on the way. I never knew what happened. Dad lived on the ranch, but he didn't own it. My grandfather held the purse strings until he died. Even then, he left the ranch to me instead of my dad." "That must have been hard on your father." "It was. They never got along." He smiled. "I missed Texas when we came here. It was very different." "I love Texas," she confessed, "especially up around Dallas. There's this place called Dinosaur Valley." "With thousands of bones," he added it with a glimmer in his eyes. "Yes, I've been there. My father was trained as a paleontologist. He taught at a college in Dallas." She caught her breath. "I'd love to study that," she said. She laughed self-consciously. "I only had 2 years of college," she confessed. "I minored in Spanish. We have a large Hispanic population in Georgia. I thought of teaching, but I just couldn't decide, so I took core courses." "I majored in business," he said. You need to know economics to run a ranch profitably. He didn't add that the ranch wasn't his main source of income. His fortune was the result of an inheritance from his grandfather that included several $1 million, plus thousands of acres near here, Benton, Colorado, and a thriving Black Angus purebred ranch. He parlayed that fortune into a much larger fortune by investing in oil stocks and buying up failing exploration companies and refineries. His inheritance plus his business sense had made him into a multimillionaire. It didn't show that he was rich. Right now he was just glad this little Violet was good company. He had that feeling that she might run out the door if he'd shown up in a stretch limo wearing a designer clothes and a Rolex, all of which he did have. "I've never been around ranches," she confessed, staring out the window. "We have big farms in Georgia, but not so many ranches, especially not in Atlanta suburbs. We're very metropolitan." "But you know about chicken farms," he teased. She laughed self-consciously. "Well, yes, I love animals." "So do I," he added. "We use old-timey methods around here. The livestock are treated like part of the family. They're all purebred. We breed for certain traits that they will pass down to their progeny. We don't run beef cattle," he added. When she looked perplexed, "You don't?" she asked, surprised. He shrugged. "Hard to kill something you raised from a baby," he said. "I'm partial to fish and chicken. I don't eat a lot of beef." She was fascinated, and it showed. He laughed. "Not that I don't mind a well-cooked steak," he added, "as long as it's not one of my prize Anguses. There are always pictures in the local cattle journal of cattle sales." "We have production sale here in February," he told her. "It's a big deal. We entertain a lot of out-of-state buyers. We feed them great barbecue and hope they'll spend plenty of money." "You sell off the little cows, then?" she asked. He chuckled at her terminology. "Yearlings, mostly," he said. "Some open heifers and some pregnant ones and a few bulls." She was out of her depth. It sounded very complicated. "Only to an Eastern tenderfoot," he teased gently. She smiled back a little shyly and sipped her coffee. "I like your house," she said in a brief, vaguely uncomfortable silence. "It looks just like I'd expect in a Western ranch house to look." He frowned slightly. "Never been out West?" She shook her head. "No. Mom and Dad lived in New York, and then I went up to visit a lot, but I've only seen the States back in the East." "Does your father still live here?" "There? No." She sipped her coffee, wincing at her blunt reply. "He came out here because he had a cousin who worked at a local equipment store," she added hurriedly. "His cousin had already moved on, but he gave him a good reference, and Daddy's worked here for about a month, and like I have at the restaurant." "Big city people," he mused, studying her. "The culture shock must be extreme." She flushed and fumbled for her coffee cup. "It is, a little, I guess. I got used to the traffic noises and the sirens in Atlanta. The small house Dad and I rent is close to the railroad, so that it's nice at night." She laughed. "It's like home." She didn't add that she moved into a luxurious house on the lake north of Atlanta to get away from those traffic noises. She missed the lake. "What did you do in Atlanta? Another waitressing job?" She couldn't tell him that. It might lead to an embarrassing question about why she left such a lucrative position to get a minimum wage job out of Colorado. "I did feature stories for a newspaper," she said finally. It wasn't so far from the truth. She started out as a newspaper reporter after college, working her way up to news editor before her father introduced her to some people in New York. She ended up doing screenplays, a much more profitable career. Gone now, it was gone, just like the life she had. He wondered why she looked so stricken. "Newspaper jobs must be thin on the ground these days," he remarked. "Almost everything is digital now. I get my news fix on the internet." She smiled. "So do I. But the local paper is very nice. I like the features about the old-fashioned ranch work and the recipe page." He smiled back. "Do you cook?" "Oh, yes," she replied. "I'm partial to French cuisine because of the sauces, but I like Tex-Mex too. Anything spicy." She sighed. "I used to have a gourmet herb patch that I babied all year. I had raised beds, so I had herbs at Christmas to add to my recipes." Her face was sad, and she recalled the past. Those had been good days when her mother was still alive before the fame, and when the tragedy had taken her mother's life and sent Cassie and her father running far away from the notoriety. "I have a herb patch all of its own, but it's in a glassed greenhouse," he remarked. Hard to keep those little things alive out here in the winter. It can be brutal in the mountains." "I've heard that," she replied. "They said that one year you guys had a foot of snow." He chuckled. "Most years we have a foot of snow," he mused. "Sometimes 6 feet." She gasped. "But how do you drive in that?" "You don't," he said. "Not until the snowplows come, at least. On the ranch we have heavy equipment that we can use to clear a path out to the road." He shook his head. "It's hard on the cattle, but it works a lot to keep them alive. We have lean-tos in the pastures and a big barn of corrals where we can bring the pregnant cows and heifers up to get out of the worst of the weather." She liked that. She smiled. "I never thought of ranchers being kind of to cattle," she said. "I mean, we hear about slaughterhouses and—" "We don't eat purebreds," he interrupted, and his eyes twinkled. "Too expensive." She laughed. "I guess so." She searched his face. "Do you have pets?" He sighed. "Too many," he replied. "We have cattle dogs, border collies, that they help with the roundup. They're not really pets, but I keep a couple Siberian huskies, and we have cats in the barn. They keep the rodent population down." "The cats, you mean?" He grinned. "The huskies, mostly," he corrected. "Best mousers on the place. The cats, I'm told, are jealous of their ability." "You talk to cats?" she teased. "All the time. I talk to myself, mostly," he added with a chuckle. "Bad habit." "Only if you answer yourself," she replied. He sighed and leaned back in the chair with his coffee cup. "I was engaged," he said, after a minute, "until someone overheard her bragging to her friends about how she'd marry me and then go live in the city and get far away from this run-down wreck of a ranch." She winced. "I'm so sorry," she said. "That must have hurt your pride." He was surprised at her compassion. He was also suspicious. Marge had been very sympathetic at first, too, but it was all an act, a means to an end. He was a warrior now, and then he was warier now than he'd ever been before. "Sorry. Don't have my glasses on." "It's a little run down, I guess," he conceded after a minute. He grimaced. "I've spent a lot of time drinking too much." He didn't add why. He also didn't add that he had let the ranch and the business slide while he got over the tragedies in his life, that he had dumped him in Marge's lap. Marge had been newer, worse to tragedy, if that was even possible. He was usually better judge of character, but he'd been lonely, and Marge had played him. That was on Carrie, whose sense of mischief was getting old. He introduced J.L. to Marge, and the mutual attraction had been immediate. He missed Marge. It took a lot of getting over, but not only because she left him. "My dad drank for a while," she said unexpectedly, staring into the coffee cup. "It was hard to convince him to stop." He frowned. "Why'd he drink?" he asked bluntly. She sighed. "My mother died," she said, warping an anguished time into 3 quiet words. "I see. Had they been married long?" 30 years, she replied. "They'd given up hope that they would have kids when I came along," she added, with a sad smile. "I wasn't born until 5 years until they were married." "Marriage," he made a face. "Not a future I've seen for myself, and it hadn't been until Marge caught him in a weak moment. As a rule, women came and went in his life. For years they've been permissible hors d'oeuvres, but now Marge, and he lost interest. He never wanted another painful experience like the one he had with her." "Don't you like children?" she asked innocently. His face closed up. There was something dark and disturbing in his expression. For a few seconds he got up. "Well, if you're ready, I'll run you into town." "Oh, but I can call my father," she began, flushing. "I've been too much trouble already." "Not so much." He picked up her empty cup and put it with his into the sink. He picked up his keys. "Let's go." She followed him out to the SUV. Only then did she notice that the ranch house needed a coat of paint and repairs on the front walk. The fences looked as if they'd been white, but the paint was peeling off them now. The rain seemed to emphasize the neglect around her. She wondered why he had not made repairs, and decided that he probably didn't have the money. The SUV he drove was nice, but it wasn't the newest model, and he was probably making payments on it. Certainly his clothes, a shirt with frayed color and jeans that were torn where they were draped off his scuffed, worn cowboy boots, didn't reflect any great wealth. "Your ranch is nice," she said as they drove away, and she wondered once again how a poor rancher could afford to run purebred livestock. Perhaps he had a partner somewhere who contributed money. "It keeps me running," he said with an absent smile. They rode in companionable silence. Cassie was surprised at the comfort she felt sitting beside him. It was an odd thing to feel. He was very handsome in his own way, and she liked his deep, velvety voice, but he wasn't the sort of man who she was used to at all. Her male friends back east, and there had never been a serious one, were obsessed with the gym and proper diet. They preferred an evening at the theater or the symphony orchestra. None of them would have considered a life on a cattle ranch. "Where?" he asked when they reached Benton. She caught her breath. "Sorry, I was lost in thought." "It's on the 3rd Street, just off Main, about a block from the Quick Stop." He chuckled. "The old Barrett place?" he replied. "Yes, I know it. Jed Barrett lived there all his life. When he died, there was no family, so the house went on market to pay his funeral expenses. A local businessman owns it. He didn't want to sell the house of the property it sits on, so he rented it out while he decided to put up on the acreage." "You mean like a ranch?" "I mean like a subdivision," he mused, "or an apartment house." "Oh, dear," she said with a long sigh. "I loved it because it was so remote," she confessed. "Lots of room to walk and think. And there's a little creek out back." He grimaced. He liked lonely places to walk, too. It will take him some time to work this out," he added comfortingly. "He's overseas right now, taking care of some business in Australia. He owns a huge cattle station there." "He's Australian?" she asked, surprised. He chuckled. "His father was. Rance was born here in Colorado, but his father had properties all over Australia and South America. Rance was managers for all of them. But he likes the on-hand approach. He says it keeps his employees on their toes if he walks unexpectedly from time to time." "I see," she replied. "He's a nice enough guy," he said easily. "A little abrasive, but it's understandable. He had some issues over the years." He glanced at her. "You didn't meet him when you rented the house?" "Dad did," she said. "I was at work. We've been living in the local motel." She said that because there was only one motel in Benton. It was nice enough, but paying for 2 rooms indefinitely had threatened to wipe out their combined savings. Her father had heard about the place at work and called Rance Barkley at just the right time to obtain it as a rental. "Expensive living in motels," he remarked. She nodded. "Very." "Why Benton?" he asked curiously as he pulled into the street. "Because Dad's cousin lived here." She sighed. It seemed like a good place as any to start over. "I guess the city's got too much for you," he teased. She smiled back. "Yes, it did, for both of us. Honestly, we wanted to live someplace where we didn't have so many memories of my mother. Besides, Benton is nice." "Nice if you don't like the night life," he chuckled. "They roll up the sidewalks every night at 6 sharp." "That doesn't bother me," she replied. "I like peace and quiet." She didn't add that she'd gotten used to it on the lake. He laughed. "Good thing we don't have much excitement around here." "That sure suits me well." He pulled into the long driveway, pulled up next to an old pickup truck sitting in the front of the little white frame house. The property was surrounded by pasture land that ran to the horizon in the shadow of the mountains. "I always liked this place," he remarked. "It's very pretty," she agreed. She grimaced. "Look, I'm sorry about the picket sign." "I'll tear a strip off Carrie when we'll be even. Don't you worry about it." "Thanks, and thanks for the coffee and the ride." She opened the door and jumped down, pausing to get her wet faded sign off the floorboard in the back seat. "Stay warm," he said. She smiled. "Drive safely," she replied, and closed the passenger door before she saw his bemused expression. He waved and drove off. She propped her sign against the wall and opened the door. Her father, tall and thin and graying, looked up from the sofa, where he was reading a book. "Back so soon?" She grimaced. "He doesn't have a single chicken house," she said with a long sigh. His eyebrows rose. "Then why were you picketing him?" "It's a long story," she replied, shedding her wet coat. She hung it up and plopped down on the easy chair across from the sofa. "He owns this run-down ranch," she began. Chapter 2. "A run-down ranch? An owner who drinks and a purebred cattle?" he mused. "I think he was having you on, Cassie," he chuckled. "A poor man can't afford to run purebreds. They cost thousands of dollars. A good herd of bull alone sometimes goes for $500,000. "Oh, I see. Well, he was nice about it, anyway. He gave me coffee, and he dried my jeans, and oh my gosh, my clothes are still there!" she exclaimed. "I forgot all about them." He was watching her with wide, stunned eyes. "Those clothes belong to his "These clothes belong to his housekeeper's daughter," she explained. "He handed them to me in the bathroom. I put them on and he put my things in the dryer. My outer things," she added. "I wasn't about to take off my under things in the strange man's house." He smiled gently. "You are so like your mother," he said with a sad smile. "She was straight-laced, too, very Victorian in her attitudes. I guess we didn't do you any favors giving you such an old-fashioned upbringing when the rest of the world is so permissive." "I like me just the way I am, thanks," she laughed. "I like being out of step with the world. I like to stay healthier for one thing," she added, tongue in cheek. He sighed. "Yes, but you don't date anybody." "Well, I dated Jackson Hill," she pointed out. "Sweetheart, Jackson Hill was gay," he reminded her. "He was great company, too," she replied, smiling incessantly. "His parents were so conventional, and he loved them so much that he didn't want them to know. We went out together so we both could hide. I didn't want a loose relationship with some career-minded man, and he didn't want notoriety. We both were suited for each other," she sighed. "I miss him. He was so much fun." He nodded. "Well, I guess we'll settle for what we can get in life. I would have liked to have grandchildren, though," he added with a smile. She had a sudden picture of that reclusive rancher with a baby in his arms and swatted it away. "Maybe someday," she said. "Right now I'm busy learning how to balance a plate full of food on a tray without dropping it while I set up the tripod." He laughed out loud. "And I'm busy learning how to persuade ranchers to buy equipment they may not need." "I dare say that we'll both do well once we learn the ropes," she replied. He sighed. "I keep hoping that I miss my crew." She knew it was hard for him to be such a celebrity with his own television show, loved by millions, and with one unfounded accusation by a vengeful woman it was all gone and he was in hiding. The damage had been far-reaching. His attorneys had done their best, but social media had destroyed him. It was suggested that if he got away for just a few months, things might calm down and they could reassess his position. The fact that he was innocent seemed to count for nothing. The woman who accused him, however, now had her own TV show, his former one, and she was raking in the cash and the ratings thanks to several special interest groups that had funded her, and his attorneys knew this and they hired one of the best investigators in the business to do some discreet snooping. There was still hope. "I miss my job, too, although it wasn't a patch of yours," she said with a wistful sigh. "The series still on TV, and there were some terrific other writers on staff, but I like to interject humor, and they didn't." "Maybe one day we both can go back to where we love," he replied sadly. "But for the time being, we're in camouflage, pretending to be normal middle-class Americans. That's not a bad thing, either," he added. "You can go get addicted to those five-star restaurants and expensive quarters. You can lose sight of those things that are really important." "Yes, like no reporters trying to knock down their doors and hiding in the trees, parachuting off onto the roof." He chuckled. "It wasn't quite that bad. Although I couldn't eat out or be seen in public, I was too recognizable." He shook his head. "Growing a beard and wearing glasses does seem to have to put them on for the time being." "Yes, you look quite judicial," she teased. He smiled. "At least you didn't have to modify your looks. Writers aren't quite as noticeable as television personalities with weekly shows." "That was my good luck," she agreed. She stretched. "I'm using my muscles I didn't even know I had. I got lazy. I spent all my life at a keyboard living in a fantasy world. I was totally looking at the world now I'm looking at the world in a totally new way." "So am I," he said. He drew a long breath. "And I hope that we're far enough away that they won't come looking for us here." "Who would?" she mused. "Honestly, working in an equipment sales has to be the last place reporters would expect to find you." "We can hope," he said. He shook his head, and his face taunted. "That woman," he bit off, "stabbed me in the back by my own executive producer, accused of sexual harassment and assault. The media flooded with lies of opinions and gossip. Journalism in this country has sunk to a whole new low." "The major media outlets are owned by a handful of people with agendas," she said simply. "Well, there's nothing we can do about that," he told her. "Millionaires make policy, and corporations own everything of worth. It will only take a disaster of some kind to provide a reset, and I hope that I'm long gone when it happens." "You're practically immortal," she teased, "and we don't need a reset. We just need people to demand objective reporting. If enough do, then things will change." "Optimist." Her father put down his book. "Speaking of news, which we never watched anyway until my sudden notoriety, I suppose we should buy a TV set." "What for?" she asked. "We hardly watched TV even when we had one." I was thinking about all those movies we had on the Cloud, he replied. Now that I wouldn't mind at all, she agreed, laughing. How about we buy one tomorrow? Something cheap. A used gaming system would be nice, too, so you can play those games you've always got on the Cloud, he teased. Her gaming habit amused him. She loved console games on the Xbox One and had several that were her hobby. I miss my games, she confessed. She frowned. But I'd better be off the internet for now. A few people knew my gamer tag, she added. Best not to advertise that I'm still around. He nodded solemnly. I'll keep on my attorneys, he said. If that investigator turns something up on Trudy Blaze, things might start to look up. They may, but in the meantime I have a nice job, and I'm happy to get a check every 2 weeks, she said. We could have landed in a worse place. Yes, we could. He frowned as he sneezed. You need to push your friend Carrie into a thorny bush. You're sneezing. It was cold, it was wet, and you have bad lungs. She shook her head. I'm fine, she said firmly. Nothing to worry about. I've been much better with the inhaler. He sighed. If you say so. She got up, smiling. I'll start some of those rolls rising so we can have them for supper, she said. How about cook au vin? He gave her a droll look. How about chicken and mashed potatoes? He countered. She sighed. Ah, poverty, she laughed. I guess it'll be good for our characters. Everybody has had hard times, sweetheart, he said softly. Everybody has to get through them. She just smiled on her way to the kitchen. J.L. pulled into the front of his house and studied it with a frown. He hadn't noticed how dilapidated it was getting. Honestly, since he broken his engagement, things had not mattered to him. Not even at the ranch, which was his pride and joy. But now it was falling apart. He'd been having a whiskey after dinner every night. Sometimes it was 2 whiskeys. He hated what his life had become. He was alone and tired of his own company. His big romance had turned into a disaster. He was afraid to trust another woman because of what his, quote, fiancée, end quote, had done to him. The experience had turned him inside out. He was so depressed that he paid no attention to broken fences, to equipment that stopped working, to employees who pleaded for money to repair their infrastructure. Now it was all just catching up with him. He walked out to the big barn where his foreman Isaiah Drummond was staring underneath the hood of the truck they used to haul feed to cattle in the near pasture. He had the physique of a range rider, much as J.L. himself did, but Drum, as most people called him, was a few years younger and had a temper that cowboys tried to avoid. He looked up at the boss approaching, his black eyes flashing in a lean, tanned face under the thick head of black hair. Damn thing's on the blink again, he muttered, and the bobcat has a flat tire. Horrors and wonders, the world's ending, J.L. drawled sarcastically. Drum's chiseled mouth pulled down on one side. It will if you don't get on the ball, boss, he said curtly. If things go downhill fast enough, you could end up with a whole wheat farm and not instead of a ranch. J.L. shrugged. Not likely. Beef's at a premium since all the flooding down in Texas last summer. Yes, well, growing cattle needs food, and to have food you need to have working equipment to plant things with. J.L. sighed. Okay, call that repairman from the equipment company and let him come out here and fix it. Drum managed a smile. Okay. Any other little headaches? Drum pushed back the beat-up old black Stetson he wore. I hear you taking up chicken farming. J.L.'s widened. Huh? Drum grinned. You had a picketer out front accusing you of abusing hens? Oh, that. He smiled reminiscently. Carrie told her I had some chicken houses. She was soaking wet and sneezing. Funny little thing. Red gold hair, blue eyes, thin as a rail, repressed as all hell. Works as a waitress in town. I drove her home. Drum waited, curious. J.L. gave him a droll look. I don't have any inclination to let a woman back into my life. Not in the near future, maybe never. His face darkened. I've got enough trouble as it is. I can understand your viewpoint, came the reply, but you have to understand that some women are mercenary as some men. They have ways of hiding it. You have to look deeper than the surface, like beauty. You ever been married? Never. Came close once. Drum shook his head. She didn't want to live with a man who worked around cattle and smelled like fertilizer, she said. He shrugged. Wasn't much of a sacrifice at that. She couldn't cook, and she wanted a life of leisure. I told her she'd have to look for a richer man than me. So she found one. He laughed. I saw her once. Then when I took up that trip to Denver to check out some cattle at the auction for you, She said she wished she'd go back to in a time and we'd make a different choice. I guess she was paying a price for that wealth. People mostly do, J.L. sighed. I don't understand greed. Me neither, Drum replied. Well, I'll go call that equipment repairman and see what he can get out here. The chicken picketer's father works there, she said. That must be the new fella. He shook his head. Owner says he sits and reads equipment manuals all the time so he can understand what he sells. He frowned. Odd man, New York accent, and he doesn't have the hands of a man who has done any sort of physical labor. I'd have pegged him as a businessman. He seems out of place. Curious. It is, but it's not my business. Nor mine, J.L. told him. I've been taking a look around this place. We have lots of things that need to be repaired and painted. I've been living in a blue funk, whatever it is. Time I snapped out of it and got some things done. And don't agree with me, he said suddenly when Drum opened his mouth. I'll call a contractor first thing in the morning and get the ball rolling. Another thing, the chicken picketer left her clothes here. I put them in the dryer. But as she went home wearing Bessie's daughter's jeans and shirt, I guess I'll have to make time to take them to her. Is she pretty? The chicken picketer? Drum teased. J.L. chuckled. She was pretty bedraggled while she was here. Not much to look at, but a tender heart and plenty of compassion. I used to think looks were the most important thing. Now I'm convinced that a good heart is better. I'll take pretty, thanks, came the amused reply. You're welcome to all the pretty women you can find. I'm off women for life, he added. I've never been taken for a ride again. Where have I heard that before? Never you mind. Get busy. I'm going to go right out to the line of the cabin and see how Parker's doing out there with the new horses. Why won't you let him work here, close to the house? J.L.'s raised both eyebrows. You ever hear him cuss? Oh, I'm not having him around when visitors come to look at our new crop of cattle. He'll put everybody back up, and I'll have to sell my calves off at a loss. We could rope him, tie him to a post, and gag him. J.L. pursed his lips and chuckled. What a thought. But no, it's just as well to leave him where he is. If I have to call him down about his behavior, he'll quit, and he's the best man with horse I've ever seen. I'll echo that. That man's got a gift. It's that crow in him, J.L. replied. He said his people have a way with animals that runs all the way back through his lineage, all the way back to his great-grandfather. He can have gentle horses without any rough treatment. Horses love him. I mean, they really love him. They follow him around the fence when he's outside. Imagine a guy with a talent like that, Drum said. He made a face, and a mouth like that. He was in the military. He said he learned to cuss dodging bullets in Iraq. He shook his head. I've dodged my share, but I'm not equal in his cussing contest. He added, chuckling, I guess we all have a few rough edges. His are sharper than knives, but he is good with the horses. Yes, okay, you call the equipment people. I'll go talk to Parker. Sure thing, boss. The line cabin was about a mile from the ranch house. She set back from the lodgepole pines with majestic mountains making an exquisite backdrop for the long open pasture, cross-fenced and stretched to the horizon. The cabin was efficient but small with its rustic timbers. It looked like a part of the landscape. J.L. dismounted at the front porch and tied his horse to the rail. There was nobody around. He rapped on the door. But there was no answer. Odd. He thought Parker was certainly here somewhere. He wondered what was going on. He opened the door and walked in. There was a fire in the fireplace, a hot, fresh pot of coffee set on the counter with an empty cup by it. Wherever Parker was, he must not have expected he'd be gone long. J.L. went back outside and looked around. Hey, Parker, he called. No answer. He walked around the house and saw hoofprints headed down the road, and he got back in the saddle and followed him. He hadn't gone far when he heard a rifle shot. Heart racing, he turned around and his horse in the direction of the shot and urged him forward. Nothing to worry about, Hardy, he told the horse, patting him gently on the mane to calm him. The horse was nervous enough without loud noises. Come on, fella. Let's just go just a little way to go. The horse moved forward, but not quickly. In the distance, J.L. caught the sight of the red plaid shirt. Closer, he could tell that it was Parker by his red, tall, lean body with the white Stetson he wore. But he could tell better by the language that was audible even as far away. Parker was eloquent. He rode down to the pasture, and Parker left his horse on the side of the fence. He was on the other side, standing over the carcass of a calf. He looked up. J.L. narrowed his blue eyes in a face as hard as stone. Wolf, he said angrily. He indicated the calf. J.L. grimaced. The calf had been savaged while it was still alive. From the look of it, Parker had obviously put it out of its misery. I wish all those damn bleeding heart liberals living in the apartments in the cities would come out here and see what we have to deal with because of their blankety blank legislation, Parker said angrily. In fact, I wish we could shove a few of these starving wolves into their apartments with 'em. My, what a change of heart the survivors would have. Bad cowboy, J.L. said, shaking a finger at him. Parker sighed. Yeah, I know. I just get tired of seeing these little things in such agony. Was it Two Toes? J.L. asked, referring to an old and wily wolf who was known to the ranchers locally. The wolf was past his prime and couldn't find a pack that would let him join, so he was hunting for game he could catch. That meant helpless calves that wandered too far from the herd. I think so. Didn't have time to count toes, Parker added, or see his face to identify him, but he was snow white and limping. He looked like 10 miles of rough road. That limp pretty much identifies him as Two Toes. We need to adopt him, lock him up, and feed him canned chicken, J.L. said whimsically. He'd been a threat to nobody then. Or find a wildlife rehabilitator who could be bribed to threaten to take him on and feed him canned chicken. J.L. chuckled. That's really not a bad idea, he said. I'll talk to Butch Matthews and see if I can't sell him on that idea. He's always talking about wolves. He loves them. I don't mind them in a pack. Mostly they avoid ranches. Two Toes is a separate and individual case. You can't scare him. You can't even intimidate him. He just does what he wants to and lopes off when he gets the scent of you. Well, he'll be old and toothless and hungry one day. Parker gave him a dirty look. Well, I won't be eating poor little calves who gets lost, he returned. If you were starving, you just might. That earned him another nasty look. J.L. sighed. Well, I'll go back home and I'll let you know when I talk to Butch. He may have a way to take a few men and hunt down Two Toes in that case. Don't mind hunting him if he'll be leaving here, Parker replied. He pursed his lips. I've been wondering if the wolf stew tasted any good. You'd have to parboil that old devil for a week to get him tender, and he's too stingy to do much for your taste buds, J.L. pointed out. Parker chuckled. Point taken. Cassie was back at work the next day at the Grey Dove 2 days later. Oh, scratch that. Let's start from the top. Cassie was back at work at the Grey Dove 2 days later. At least she thought she learned to carry a tray without dumping half the drinks on it. Her boss, Mary Dodd, had been very kind and patient. It made Cassie work even harder. So few people these days were patient at all. You were doing very well, Mary told her. Except for the coffee, Cassie said, grimacing. I'm so sorry. You've only dropped a cup one time this whole week, Mary said, trying to find a bright note. And we allow for ceramic breakage in the budget, you know. She leaned forward. When I used to work here years before I bought this place, I turned 3 plates of spaghetti on a tray into a lap of a vacationing millionaire from D.C. Cassie's lips fell open. What did you do? She exclaimed. I bawled and I apologized and I bawled some more. What did he do? She persisted. Mary smiled. He married me. Cassie chuckled. I began to see the light. He gave me the money to buy this restaurant with the idea that I might never improve enough to be able to hold down a job in it, so I hired people who were less clumsy than I am. Not so much, Cassie began. Mary patted her on the back. You're doing fine, really you are. Don't worry, life is an adventure. Every day is a gift. You have to live an hour at a time, kid. It's what keeps you going. Cassie smiled. Thanks, I really mean that. You're welcome. Now back to work. Yes, ma'am. It had been several days since Cassie had gone hurrying off to J.L. Ditton's ranch. The rancher had been very kind to her despite her antagonism when they first met. She still hadn't called him about getting her clothes back. She was way too shy. Besides, she had plenty of other clothes. She wouldn't have gone naked. Secretly, she wished that she had more nerve to call him. There was an odd vulnerability about him. He loved animals. He had a kind heart. That was far more important to Cassie than wealth. Not that J.L. was rich. The appealing paint on the house and the fences testified to that. If he had money, he'd have kept that ranch better than he did. But he had told her that he ran purebred cattle, which her father said only a rich rancher could afford to do. Still, he might have inherited them from a wealthy relative. Cassie always tried to make allowances for people. Most people it was hard to make allowances for. The woman who had ruined her father's life had driven her poor mother to a desperate act after the scandal broke. She cleaned the tables and filled the orders. It was getting easier as she went along. Mary had known that Cassie had never waited tables in her life, but she was getting the hang of it, and she worked hard. That Friday she had a familiar customer at her table. She glared at him. Carrie held up both hands. "I am sorry," she said before she could go on the attack. "I'm really sorry. Cousin J.L. read me the riot act. I swear I'll never tell another lie. Well, not to anybody he knows, at least," he added with a charming smile. "That was really nasty thing to do," she pointed out. He shrugged. "Life gets boring. I like to liven things up." She sighed. He wasn't getting it at all. She pulled out her pad. "What would you like to eat?" "What's good?" "The beef stew and the lemon pie." "Fine. I'll have that with black coffee. You off tomorrow?" She gave him a cold, hostile look. "No more games," he promised. "I'm not planning any more non-existent picketing parties." He pursed his lips. The scar on his lower one was blatant. She could picture a furious J.L. slugging him. "Why did your cousin slug you?" she blurted out before she thought it through. He grimaced. "Sorry. Best not to drag up painful memories." "I shouldn't have asked," she said quickly. "Stew and lemon pie. Be right out." She turned to go. "There's a bowling alley in downtown Benton," he said before she walked off. "I wondered if you might like to try it out with me. It's brand new." She was disconcerted. She gnawed her lower lip. She didn't quite trust him after he played that practical joke on her. She didn't know him either. J.L. had been discouraging about him. Those things added up to distrust, and she was too polite to admit. She forced a smile. "Thanks, but I promised Dad I'd help him with a project this weekend." He just smiled, seemingly not offended at all. "No problem. Maybe I'll ask you out again sometime." She didn't reply. She went to get his order. His narrow eyes watched her go, and there was a calculating expression that she couldn't see. Nobody told her, but Carrie held grudges, especially when women gave him the cold shoulder. The woman who messed up J.L.'s life had started out as Carrie's girl. J.L. thought that when she'd seen the size of his ranch and knew that he was rich, she'd tossed Carrie out of her life and wormed her way into J.L.'s affections. It wasn't true, but Carrie had told J.L. all about it when he succeeded in prying Marge out of his cousin's life. Carrie had been shattered when Marge walked right over to him to get to his cousin. She'd been really in love, but Carrie felt that she belonged to him. They dated for several weeks before he introduced her to J.L. He wanted her for keeps, but she'd gone running to his cousin. Well, it turned out badly, especially when he told J.L. a few things that caused him to throw her out of his life. J.L. wanted to start drinking shortly thereafter and wanted nothing to do with Carrie. His cousin had never admitted to being the serpent in paradise, but J.L. was suspicious these days. It had soured their relationship. Carrie was sorry about it from time to time, but she'd been his girl first. He'd been upset about losing her to a richer man, even if the man was his cousin. He'd sent that red-haired waitress out to picket the ranch as a joke. But he found Cassie interesting, and he wanted to take her out. She was cool with him, which made her a challenge. He liked women he had to chase. Now it was just a matter of finding a way to get close to her, and to keep her out of his cousin's sight. He wasn't going to lose another woman to J.L. Cassie, blissfully ignorant of her customer's thoughts, brought out his meal and dessert along with the strong black coffee he ordered. "Bowling is fun," he remarked as she wrote out the ticket. "You really ought to put your father's project and come with me." She just smiled. "Sorry, no can do." He shrugged. "Your loss." He tossed her a flirty smile. "I don't have any trouble getting women to go out with me." "How nice for you," she said with a careless smile. He glowered at her. "Look, I'm sorry I tricked you onto picketing J.L.'s ranch," he said reluctantly. He didn't like the apology, and it made him look weak. She laid the ticket beside his plate. "No problem." He slid a hand around her waist and smiled. "You might give me a chance to make it up to you," he began, and his hand slipped lower, whether accidental or not. She turned her hand, bent his the wrong way, pulled him out of the seat, and put him on the floor. He lay there looking up at her with wide eyes and a bruised arm. "You touch me like that again," she said very softly, "and I'll cripple you before I sue you for sexual harassment." Mary Dodd had seen what went on. She moved to the table and stood over Carrie. "And that's called just desserts," she said coldly. My hand slipped, he said, wincing as he dragged himself to his feet. I swear. He turned to Cassie. I'm really sorry. It was truly an accident. I'd never treat a decent woman that way on purpose. He looked so pitiful that Cassie believed him. Never again, she cautioned him. He put his hand over his heart. I'll just sit here, eat my stew and pie, and not make another accidental move. If you do, Mary said softly, it will be the last time you eat here. Is that clear? Nobody harasses my waitresses, she added. I'm really sorry, he repeated. He grinned. No more slippy hands. Honest. He was incorrigible. Mary rolled her eyes. She walked off, shaking her head. Cassie laughed. He did look so miserable. Am I forgiven? He persisted. This once, she replied. He crossed his heart. I'm turning over a new leaf right here now, ma'am, he said, and grinned. Honest. He sat down and dug into his stew. Several people had amused smiles on their faces as Cassie went on to the next table and the next order. You okay? Mary asked Cassie a little later, after Carrie had left and the customers had thinned out a little. Cassie smiled. I'm fine, she said. She was uneasy. Confrontations unsettled her, especially after what she and her father had suffered publicly only a short time ago. I'm sorry that I caused a scene. Nonsense, Mary said. Just as well to let that man see his limits. He's not mean, but he can be overbearing. He won't again, not with you, she chuckled. Cassie smiled. I almost felt sorry for him, she confessed. How did you do that, if you don't mind me saying? She asked. I'm a black belt in Taekwondo, she said simply. I've taken lessons for 5 years. I used to compete, she added sadly. She smiled. I can't do it any more. Well, that's a shame. It was a sight to see, Mary told her. Cassie grinned. I truly enjoyed the look on his face, and maybe his hand did slip. Maybe it didn't, came the amused reply, but that's Carrie. He's been no end of trouble to J.L., his cousin, she added in a lowered voice as they walked back behind the counter. In fact, he was responsible for his cousin's broken engagement. He was? He carried tales to both of them. It was a shame what he did to J.L. He really loved that woman, she said. Gossip was that she fell hard for J.L. too. Carrie put a stop to that with a few whispers in her ear and J.L.'s. There's no excuse for the way that Carrie treated her. He was jealous, you see, because she was his girl first and she threw him over for J.L. He was trying to get me to go bowling with him. I don't like to go out with men that I don't know, she added softly. Wise woman, Mary said. In Carrie's case, very wise. He drinks to excess. J.L. just goes to bed when he's had too much liquor. Carrie gets in fights, or he used to. Her eyes twinkled. Not so much since the last one. Anyway, J.L. can handle him when he's drunk, if he has to. When J.L.'s sober, that is, she added. When he's sober? Cassie probed. Best not to carry tales, Mary replied. Sorry. No, it's my fault. I shouldn't have asked. It's just that Carrie set me on picketing Mr. Denton's ranch because Carrie said he was torturing chickens in his hen house. She made a face. I must have been far more naive than I thought I was. I went out there alone and stood in the freezing cold and rain until Mr. Denton drove up and found me. He took me to the ranch house and let me dry my stuff. He even made me coffee, she sighed. He's very nice. I just felt so bad about what I done. Mary grinned. Trust me, J.L. will dine out on that story in a few weeks. Chicken houses. She shook her head. Eastern tenderfoot, she chided affectionately. Cassie laughed. That's what he called me. I guess I am. I'll get back to work. Thanks for standing up for me, she added softly. Nobody messes with my employees, Mary said simply and smiled. Chapter 3. Cassie didn't tell her father about the unpleasant in the restaurant with Carrie. He had enough on his mind without having to worry about her. She fixed supper for him, and they watched a movie on the little TV that he bought from a co-worker. She didn't let on that she had a care in the world. The next morning she was surprised to find J.L. Denton occupying a booth in the restaurant where she worked. He dropped his white Stetson on the seat beside him. He had a black, thick hair and faint wave as he was wearing a western-cut shirt with jeans and boots. Cassie's heart skipped a beat when he looked up at her, and she came to take his order, but he wasn't smiling. What did Carrie do to you yesterday? He asked quietly. There was a nervous look in his eyes, dark eyes that made her faintly nervous. She hesitated. She didn't like carrying tales. Gossip was what had cost her father's his job, and the ensuing notoriety put Cassie on the run as well. Come on, he said, his deep voice dropping softly. Tell me what happened. She took a deep breath and glanced around. The boss was in the kitchen, and there was only old Mr. Bailey in the restaurant this early, and he couldn't hear a cannon go off. He wanted me to go out with him, she said, lowering her voice. I didn't want to. He kept trying to coax me, and then he slid his hand over well, my bottom. She fought a blush. And I put him on the floor. You? He asked, spellbound. I put him on the floor, she said simply. I'm a black belt in Taekwondo. Did Carrie know that? She pursed her lips and her blue eyes twinkled. I think he might suspect it now. He was very apologetic. The boss saw what happened from the kitchen. She told him if he ever did it again, he'd never get back in here. He apologized for 3 minutes straight. He said his hand slipped. She added, she drew in a breath. I'm so sorry for making a scene. Why? He asked, searching her eyes. That's what should have happened. No man has the right to harass a woman on the job. I fired cowboys who got fresh with my housekeeper's daughter. She was impressed. I thought you might be mad, she said. He's your cousin. By marriage, not by blood, he said shortly. She didn't mention what she'd heard about Carrie and J.L.'s fiancé, but it ran through her mind. If he starts giving you any trouble, you call Todd Blakely. He's the police chief here in town, and a friend of mine. Tell him I told you to call. He'll take care of Carrie, and he'll enjoy it, he added. It was Todd who put Carrie in jail for the assault. Carrie's girlfriend slapped him. He called the law on her. He smothered a grin at Cassie's expression. He called the police station because his girlfriend slapped him? Cassie's eyes wide-eyed. But you said he went to jail for assault, she added, confused. He pursed his chiseled lips. Well, see, when Todd got there, Carrie swung on him. Our chief is a martial artist, too. Carrie had lots of bruises, but assault on the police officer is a felony, and Carrie couldn't talk Todd out of the charge. So he spent a couple of weeks behind the bars before his attorney pulled a few strings and got him out. He shook his head. Whatever he is, Carrie's still part of one of the founding families of Benton. That reputation goes a long way around here, and Carrie had been drinking, which he almost never used to do. I heard about him going to jail, she said. I thought it was because he was dangerous. No, he's not dangerous, and he doesn't want to go back, he assured her. So he'll be more careful, but don't trust him. I don't mean that he's dangerous. He's mostly mischievous. He's like Two Toes. He's a sneak. Two Toes? Our resident bad boy. He's an old wolf. He preys on our calves because he can't get a pack to take him on. Apparently, he sneaks around my ranch looking for helpless little strays. Oh, how awful, she said softly. He smiled. He liked her nurturing attitude. She reminded him of his mother, long ago when he was small, and she'd been like this, all heart. We're hoping we can talk the local wildlife rehabilitator to take him on. I don't want to kill him, but we have to stop him. Do they let people keep wolves as pets? She asked. He laughed. Not so much. You have to have training for their sort of work. Most of the rehabilitators are overworked. All of them around here specialize. We have one for raptors, one for small mammals, one for mammals, that sort of thing. What a wonderful job, she sighed. You wouldn't think so if your phone rang off the hook all hours with people needing help. I don't know, she replies. It sounds like a worthwhile occupation. She glanced toward the kitchen. Her boss was coming out of it. Cassie's worried expression told him a lot. 2 eggs scrambled with bacon and toast and grape jelly, he said at once. Strong black coffee to go with it? She smiled, and her eyes mirrored her gratitude, and she jotted down the order. I haven't spilled anybody's coffee so far today, she said. I spill mine half the time, he said easily. I trip over my own 2 feet. I catch potholders on fire, he shrugged. I won't mind if you spill the coffee. She laughed. Okay, thanks. No problem. She went at once to get his order. Mary gave her a secretive smile and a hidden thumbs up. Cassie flushed. Mary laughed at her newest employee, dashed to the counter, and gave the order to the cook. Cassie managed to get the coffee to J.L. in one piece without dropping the cup. She let out a sigh of relief when she had it on the table before him, along with a napkin and silverware. Not bad, he remarked. You know, your clothes are still at the house. Oh, gosh, I keep forgetting about them, she exclaimed apologetically. It wasn't a complaint, he replied, but I thought you might like to come over and get them on Saturday. You can see the calves. Her eyes lit up. You have calves? Lots of them. Even a pair of twins, he added. We have our cows drop calves in early spring when the young grass is just coming up and most of the snow and the sleet is done with. He sighed heavily. Not that it's quite springy just yet, he added, shaking his head. We've got our hands full with the latest snowfall. I love snow, she said softly. It's so beautiful. Not when you're trying to shovel it out of the cattle pens and the feeders. She laughed. Yes, I don't have to do those things. Don't they have snow where you come from? She made a face. 1 or 2 days a year. Heaven, he retorted. It's a matter of perspective, she pointed out. What we don't have often becomes a joy. I can think of several appropriate replies to that, he said with a wicked smile, the main one raging indigestion. Oh boy, can I sympathize with that. I have heartburn so bad I have to take medicine for it. Acid reflux? He asked. She laughed. Yes. I have it too. He shook his head. The sad part is that I love spicy food, preferably Tex-Mex with lots of salsa and peppers. Can't eat it that often. I like spicy Asian food, she confessed, especially Chinese. He laughed. Kindred spirits. So, he added, Saturday morning about 10 I'll come get you. Her face colored. She was shy, and it was difficult for her to be herself with a man, but she was excited and happy that she showed as well. I would like that, she said, trying to rein in her enthusiasm. So would I. Cassie, isn't it? She nodded. Cassie. Is it a nickname or your actual name? She sighed. My actual name is Cassandra, she confessed. My mother was reading a romance novel just before I was born and loved the heroine's name, so Cassandra I became, but everyone just calls me Cassie. I like it, he said softly. She smiled. He smiled back. They exchanged a look that made her toes curl inside her shoes. Oh, your order. She laughed self-consciously and retreated to the counter to pick up his breakfast. Aren't you lucky that we're not that crowded, the cook Agatha asked with a wicked grin. He's a dish, isn't he? Cassie went red from her forehead down. Oh, Agatha. Never mind me. I always wanted a little bow and arrow and a chebrick face. Cassie wrinkled her nose at the older woman and carried the plate and saucer containing the toaster tray to the table where J.L. had cleared a path in between his coffee cup and his utensils for him. She eased the plate down and almost lost the saucer, but she recovered just in time. Oops, nearly a disaster. Sorry. He chuckled. Nice reflexes. I'll bet you're a terror on the tennis court. I don't play tennis, she said. I do. I'll teach you. She laughed. I'll trip over my own feet and go head first into the net. Okay, how about horseback riding? I've only ever been on a horse once or twice, but I really liked it, she replied. Fine. We'll forget the tennis and go riding. I'd love that. Me too. She picked up the empty tray and held it underneath her arm. 10 o'clock Saturday. He nodded and smiled. I'll look forward to it. She hated her helpless blush. Me too. She went back to the counter and put up the tray quickly because a party of 4 just walked in the door and the morning rush had just started. Technically, we should be stopping there because that's page 50. But I figure what we'll do is we'll go until the end of this chapter, which is page 61, and then we'll start at 62 tomorrow. So we're going a little bit longer than I planned. J.L. paid the bill at the counter because Cassie was in over her head trying to cover the 3 tables at once. She's shaping up nicely here, Mary told him as she returned his change, indicating Cassie. She never waited tables, but she's honest and quick to learn, and she works hard. Nice character traits, J.L. replied. She's pretty green, she said it hesitantly, not wanting to interfere. I noticed that too, he said softly, and he smiled. Another very rare trait in these overly modern times. She laughed. It is. Tell Agatha the eggs were perfect. Nobody cooks them like she does. I'll tell her, but she'll swoon, she teased. She thinks that you're the dishiest man since Sean Connery. My God, what an image to have to live up to, he returned with a grin. I'll grow a beard and practice my Scots accent. Then she'll really swoon, Mary assured him. He turned and caught Cassie's eye and waved. She tried to wave back, but dropped her order pad and then scrambled to pick it up again. She was red as a beet. He chuckled with pure pleasure and waved again as he walked out the door. You're very unsettled tonight, her father remarked when they were eating supper. It's been an odd couple of days, she replied. Carrie hasn't been back, has he? He asked her with some irritation. She just stared at him. Carrie? She asked softly, fishing for how much he knew. Small town runs on gossip, he reminded her. He chuckled. What I heard was that Carrie got fresh with you and you put him down. One of my co-workers said he wished his wife had that kind of spunk. She laughed. I wasn't going to tell you, she confessed. You have so much to worry about lately. This doesn't worry me, actually. It was nice to have something to laugh about. People say that Carrie is bad to drink and he gets aggressive. I was afraid he might come back and say something to you. No, she told him, that's not what happened at all. He swore that his hand slipped and he apologized profusely, but J.L. Denton heard about what happened too, and he came for breakfast to ask me about it. Protecting his cousin? No, protecting me, actually. She said he doesn't like his cousin. A lot of people don't like Carrie from what I heard. Mr. Denton asked me if I'd go horseback riding with him on Saturday. Well, he's got lots of calves, she added. He chuckled. Say no more. I can drive you over there and pick you up later. He's coming to get me, she returned. A gentleman. I hope so. She finished her meatloaf and mashed potatoes and put the plate to one side. I don't really know him. Everybody in town knows him, he replied. He's respected and well liked. People are still sorry for him about his fiancée walking out, something his cousin provoked, they say. That's what he says, too. You should be safe enough. You can always call me if you run out of defensive techniques. She laughed. I don't plan to throw Mr. Denton around, Dad. He was in the military, he said surprisingly. He was a master trainer in the hand-to-hand combat, they say. I expect you'll have your work cut out if you try to put him down the way you did his cousin. Well, she said with a quick breath. He does drink like his cousin, he told her, so be careful. I will. Make sure you keep your cell phone charged so you can call me if you get into a situation that you can't handle. And make sure you don't leave without your meds, he added firmly. I will, worrywart, she teased. He grinned. She didn't sleep much that night thinking about J.L. She didn't know much about men despite working around them for several years. Most of them were businessmen or entertainers that wore nice suits and expensive leisure wear, not denim and cowboy boots. J.L. was completely out of her experience. He was very attractive. She had hoped that she could keep her head. She didn't want to become a notch on his bedpost. On the other hand, he seemed like a gentleman. Her mother always said that a man treated a woman the way she signaled that she wanted to be treated. If she acted like a lady, that's how she would be treated. Her mother would have been taken aback if she'd seen Carrie in that restaurant putting his hand on her daughter's bottom. And taking water breaks in between. Accident or not, that had been offensive, and it made Cassie angry. No man had the right to be that forward with any woman. It was condescending and crude. She was glad that J.L. was angry about it, too. It made her feel better. In all the years since she graduated from high school and then college, she never had a man treat her that way. She'd never worked for the public, though, especially in a job like waitressing. And she'd been sheltered, mainly because she was been so sick so often. When she was a reporter, almost every man knew she was treated like one of the guys. Only one man had asked her out in all those years, but she turned him down. He worked for the same paper she did, and she didn't want to risk a workplace romance. She smiled, remembering what her mother had said about the fellow reporter. Her mother had been very protective. It hurt her to remember her mom, shamed and flooded with emails and nasty notes on social media. Neither Cassie nor her father had known about them until they checked her computer after she died and found them. Several had invited her to kill herself because she was married to a nasty and obscene lecher. Cassie's father had never been a lecher. He was a perfect gentleman, and he'd been completely faithful to his wife, a rarity in the circles that he moved in. Her mother had snapped under the unrelenting pressure of crusading newsmen and newswomen, ceaseless pointing fingers for her father for being one of those overbearing animals that they preyed on women who were subordinate to him at work. The tragedy was something that Cassie and her father still couldn't talk about. The wound was too new and too fresh. The only good that had come out of it, and was small consolation, was that the media backed off after the tragedy. One newscaster was angry enough to castigate his colleagues on the air for being so aggressive, unfeeling they cost a human a life. But it was like closing the gate after the horse was gone. It didn't bring back Cassie's sweet mom. She rolled over in bed and fluffed her pillow. She had to stop looking back. Life was sweet again. It was on a new start. She could live in Colorado for the rest of her life in total obscurity. No reporters would come here to harass her and her father. They'd left no trail so they could be followed, even by an aggressive reporter. This little town was like a shelter in a storm, and Cassie looked forward to making a new life here with her dad. It might be a pipe dream, she thought as she closed her eyes, but dreams were sweet when you had little else to cling to. She smiled, thinking of J.L. and Saturday as she drifted off to sleep. Saturday morning was up at 7 o'clock. Sorry, she's getting to sleep in, according to me, huh? She made breakfast, clearing away the dishes, and then spent 2 hours trying on clothes to see what looked best on her. She didn't have a large wardrobe. She and her father had packed a bare minimum to come out here, putting everything else they owned in storage for the time being. Back home in Atlanta she had nice clothes, even a few designer ones, especially a few things for the evening. But she didn't want to wear anything fancy around JL. It would be stupid and cruel to wear designer clothes around a cowboy who lived in a house that was peeling paint on a ranch but was broken fences that she wasn't going to do a number on his pride, so she wore a simple off-the-rack jeans with a pullover yellow sweater and ankle boots. She left her hair long, curling around her face and shoulders. She used bare minimum of makeup and cologne. "You look nice," her father remarked as she folded the clothes as she borrowed, which she washed and dried to give back to J.L. "Thanks," she told him. "I didn't want to look too dressy." "Nice manners," he said softly, his face saddened, "like your mother." She bit her lower lip. "Oh, how I wish we could go back and punch those reporters." "Life pays us out in our own coin," he reminded her. "God gets even with people who hurt us. They'll find out one day in this life or the next," he added. "You can't dwell on wrongdoing, even if things make you miserable. Hating only hurts you. It never hurts the person you hate." "I guess not," she conceded. "Got your rescue inhaler?" "Yes," she said, smiling. "Okay, EpiPen too?" "Right here." She patted a small purse where she carried the necessary medicines, but not likely to run into stinging insects in the snow, she pointed out. There are still venomous spiders about. I hope that they have their overcoats so they don't freeze," she said tongue in cheek. He laughed. "All right, I'll stop being overprotective. Where's your coat?" "Oops, forgot." She went back to the closet and pulled out her swing corduroy coat. It was tan and matched her ankle boots. She drew on it. He frowned. Is that going to be warm enough?" "Surely it will be," she said. "I'm layered." "I'm used to cold weather, but you aren't, sweetheart," he replied softly. "Colorado is very different, especially here in the mountains." "I'll be fine," she assured him. She listened and heard the louder purr of the truck approaching. She dashed to the window, and her heart raced. "It's him." "Well, have fun," her father said. "I will. See you later. Love you, Dad." "Love you back." She opened the door and ran outside just as J.L. was climbing out of the cab of the big SUV. He looked surprised to see her running toward him. He laughed with pure delight and went around to open the door for her. "Handholds just inside above," he said. "Thanks, it's a long way up," she laughed as she got inside. "For a shrimp like you, it is," he teased, closing the door on her mock indignant reply. He climbed in beside her and put her on his seat belt, glancing at her to make sure hers was on and in place as well before he started the big vehicle and turned it around, heading down the driveway. He was wearing a shepherd's coat over a red and black flannel shirt with jeans, big boots, and that creamy Stetson. He looked like a man who lived on the land. There was patchy snow on the side of the road. She glanced over the rolling landscape to the snow-peaked mountains beyond. "It's so beautiful here," she murmured. He smiled. "I think so." "Were you born here?" she asked. He smiled. "No, near Dallas, remember?" She ground her teeth together. "No, sorry." No problem. My father was born here. So was his father and his grandfather and so on." "It must be lonely with your parents gone," she said delicately. He nodded. "It's hard to lose both parents within a few months. Dad was never the same after she died. They were married for a long time. They loved each other very desperately. I had an older brother. I lost him overseas in the last Gulf War." He sighed. "It's lonely when you don't have anybody, well, except for Carrie, and I'd give him away to anybody who wanted a bent and broken relative to keep. He's not even a blood relative at that." She grinned. He laughed at her expression. "I told him to keep his hands to himself, but it wasn't necessary. He said he was getting a tub of liniment, and he hoped that you would understand if he went searching in another direction for company." She laughed too. "Oh, I understand perfectly. No problem." He pulled up to the front of the sprawling ranch house, and there were men working everywhere, including on the front porch. "This is why I said we would go riding," he said underneath his breath. "They seem to multiply every time I leave the house." "What are they doing?" "Upkeep and maintenance," he said as he got out of the SUV and went around to help her down. He held her in front of him for a long moment, savoring that closeness. "Something I should have been doing all along. Now it's piled up, and it takes a lot more manpower to set things right. Your eyes are the oddest shade of blue," he added, searching them in a long silence broken only by hammering nearby. "They're china blue." "Like my mother's," she said with a sad smile, but her hair was black. "I inherited mine from my grandfather. I'm the only redhead in the family right now. That's what's left of it. I have an uncle in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and a grandfather somewhere in Canada. He roams. I had a great uncle who lived up in a cabin in Alberta with a black bear." He shook his head. "No accounting for taste, I guessed." "The bear didn't eat him?" she asked. Not that we know of. He died slumped over in a poker hand at a weekly game, and he won a pot, too. That's a shame, she said. Not so much. He was always happy, always smiling. We just figured he went that way, knowing he would have wanted to go. Quick and easy. No long hospital stay or nursing home. There's a lot to be said for that. I totally agree, she said. She reached back into the SUV for a bag that she put the clothes in. I almost forgot to give these back. Thanks so much for the loan, she added, handing it to him. I'll put these in, and he indicated the bag, in the house, and you bring yours out. Bessie washed them and dried them for you. Bessie? My housekeeper. The clothes I loaned you were her daughter's. Oh, she smiled. Thank her for me. She wouldn't mind. Nita works for a bank down in Denver. She's sweet. I see. He cocked his head and smiled at her. No, you don't. I'm not carrying a torch for her. She's sweet, but she's outlived 3 husbands already. She's on number 4 now, and she's only 31. My goodness! He sighed. I guess some people have a hard time with marriage. I guess. He led the way to the front door. Want a cup of coffee before we go? He asked. That would be nice. And warming, he added, noting her slight discomfort in the way she hugged her arms around herself. You're not used to Colorado weather yet, I see. She raised her eyebrows in question. This is fur coat country, or shearling coat country. Lightweight jackets just won't cut it out here. I'm not really cold, she lied. I just had a chill. Uh-huh, he murmured. He led the way into the kitchen. She remembered it from the last time she'd been here. It was roomy, spotless, with appliances like the ones she had in storage that she cooked on when she lived in Atlanta. I love your kitchen, she said with a sigh. You must have every gourmet tool they make. Bessie does, he said, smiling. She can cook anything. Food's great, too. I'll bet. Do you cook? He asked. She nodded. I can't do haute cuisine, but I can do most any food there's a recipe for, and I can make a kind of homemade bread and rolls. I do those for Dad. He loves fresh yeast rolls, she laughed. Bessie don't do breads. I'd love to try those rolls sometime, he added, pouring the brewed coffee into 2 cups. I'll make a pan of them if you like. His eyes searched hers, and he smiled. Yes, I'd like that. She flushed a little from that intent gaze she was getting. He put her coffee in front of her and sat down next to her at the table. Do I make you nervous? He asked. She drew in a breath. A little. In a bad way? He asked, without looking at her. No, not in a bad way. She was floundering like a child in school, facing an oral book report for a book she hadn't read. He turned and stared at her quietly. His dark eyes were intense. I speak pretty bluntly sometimes, but it's the best way to set boundaries, don't you think? She swallowed. Yes. He leaned back in the chair and sipped his coffee. Okay, it's like this. I'm still getting over a failed engagement. I'm pretty raw, and I'm still not quite myself, so suppose we begin as good friends and let it go at that, for the time being. She let out a sigh. Oh, I like that. His thick eyebrows arched. You look relieved. She bit her lower lip. Look, my mother was overprotective. A lot. I wasn't allowed to date until I was in my late teens. And then I only did double dates. I don't know much about men. I never had an affair. And I've tried to avoid men who were aggressive because I'm not, well, modern. She felt as if she rambled, but he only smiled. In other words, you don't sleep around. That's it. No problem. Even if I were over my ex-fiancé, you'd have nothing to fear from me, he said softly. I don't amuse myself with innocence. She laughed. Thanks. He drew in a long, heavy breath. I'm glad we got that out of the way. I didn't want to give you the idea that I was in the market for a serious relationship. I'm not either, she confessed. Dad and I have had a traumatic time just lately, and neither of us is quite over ourselves yet, either. Oh? What happened? My mother killed herself. And I will leave you in suspense of how chapter 4 will be. Can you imagine how good this book is if we've covered 4 chapters in one night? Wow, right? So I'm on page 112, and it's almost done for me, and I cannot wait to share this entire book with you because this entire book has been outstanding so far, and it's going to get a very high rating. So you don't want to miss part 2 tomorrow night. Now I'll say my usual. Make sure that you keep your social distance of 3 feet. You're washing your hands. When you're not washing your hands, you're using your hand sanitizer. You have faith, hope, and love and much joy in your heart, with prosperity in the bank and in your heart too. And that you do something nice for someone else and they only pay you back with a thank you, and when they say, "How can I pay you?" say, "Do something nice for someone else and keep it going." God bless each and every one of you. Hope to see you tomorrow.